Hello! Live from Washington, D.C. and all around the world, welcome to another installment with the Atlantic Council GeoTech Center. Today we're talking about how we can mobilize industry to encourage multi-sector solutions to address emergent global concerns. Specifically, we're talking about COVID-19, but also thinking beyond that. What can we do in terms of climate change? What can we do in terms of detecting pollution? Cyber, are there other activities we can do that can speed up responses and allow us to know more to respond better and smarter? We have an illustrious group of panelists. It's 8 here today, including myself, and we're going to be bringing you different views from science, from health, from defense, from different perspectives from academia and industry and nonprofits about what we could do together across societies to address challenging issues where we need to know things faster. Now, let me begin with giving you an image. Imagine you went back in time to the 1920s. And back in the 1920s, you went to people and you said, there could be these things called smoke detectors. You could put them into buildings. They could alert you that there's a fire going on in the building, but even better, they could call the fire department. And while they're at it, they could activate sprinklers until the fire department got there. People probably would think you're crazy. But at the same time, we now know those things exist. Now imagine we do those same things with detecting the COVID-19 virus or other emergent issues, the equivalent of smoke detectors for other emergent issues. With that said, I'd now like to turn to each of our different panelists to begin to jumpstart this conversation. If you could real quick give us an introduction as to who you are and help answer the question. First, Lee. Lee, we're in this era in which we need to respond faster and requires data. Are there ways that industry can help instrument physical and cyber systems so that we can have more data and better data to respond faster and know faster what's going on?
Thanks, David. And absolutely, it's possible, and that's the good news. But there's many challenges to make it implementable. If industry can work in partnership with different groups and actors, that can accelerate the time to market. If industry can just jump in, just as by analogy with COVID-19, everybody jumped on the cloud. Now everybody needs to jump to the edge to innovate in Internet of Things, work for new solutions for all of these different areas of concern. The good news is the technology's there. People can just start everybody should start hacking, join the Things Network. There's 100,000 developers with Raspberry Pis and a low-raw standardized access to devices. So it's time to experiment and create systems and work together to create open up data observatories through which people can get shared access to this information. So it's the time to start.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. And I think you probably get the credit for the first time a Raspberry Pi has been mentioned with the Atlantic Council. So thank you for bringing that to the fore.
Here you go.
Excellent. With that, now I'm going to turn to Melissa. And you've seen this as well, and you've seen it from different perspectives. Could you real quick tell us who you are and what's your thoughts about what could be done to help instrument things so we can know and respond faster?
I'm Melissa Flagg. I'm a senior fellow at Georgetown University at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. I'm also an adjunct professor. I think it's a really interesting balance between wanting to lean in and be fast and protecting the civil liberties that are culturally appropriate for this country and that are very diverse. Our sort of view of personal liberties are very diverse across the nation. So I love this analogy to the smoke detector. I think there could be very localized, you walk in, it pops up on your phone, will you opt into data collection or will you answer these 3 questions? And then that's aggregated at a local level to know if the smoke alarm needs to go off, to know if there's a problem locally very quickly, but without tracking you everywhere you go all the time. Perhaps only picking it up when you're in a place where you're within sort of a crowded area and indoor space for the COVID example or other criteria depending on the emergency. I also think there's this idea of rolling resiliency that we have to build in. And so actually digging in and investigating the resiliency of our supply chains so that you don't necessarily just change to a new, singularly dependent supply chain, but you actually diversify. It may not be efficient, but I think efficiency is out the window as of 2020. And I think resiliency is going to be in fashion for a change. And let's drive some of the fragility out and have industry lean in and do some investigating and do some pilots. Maybe some industry associations could lead pilots that are regionally and industrially specific.
What I really like about what you said, Melissa, is yes, we should think regionally, we should think locally, because that may be where we actually have better approaches and things more in context. And like you said as well, we don't really want to give up what makes the United States true, which is we do value privacy. We want to make sure that's something that's baked into the system. So now I'd like to turn to two scientists and medical professionals. Would like to turn first to Mary. And Mary, for COVID-19 detection, where is the science at in terms of producing methods that will allow us to generate data to know faster and respond faster to future waves of the virus?
Sure, sure. Well, it's, thank you so much for having me. And so where are we at now? I mean, so I am an assistant professor at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and we're on a hillside with Syracuse University and Upstate Medical University. Across the three campuses, we have been aiming to set up an open data observatory that serves as an early warning system for these types of pathogens. And what we aim to do is to use wastewater sampling techniques to identify and quantify RNA from SARS-CoV-2, which, and what we've been doing, what the microbiologists on our team have been doing, is to really build on existing science in a cost-effective way to do this type of identification and quantification. Right now, we've already done piloting at the county level, and we have more counties coming in all the time, and more partners coming in. And what we really aim to do is to try and create a smoke detector style early warning system where and this is specifically relevant, right, for SARS-CoV-2, because it has such a long period before traditional health professionals could be doing testing or identification when you've already had spread or transmission. And so our early warning system, which we've piloted and have really good results for so far, would help to identify these things much earlier in the pathogen's life cycle, and that would allow for decision makers to come in earlier in the game, right? And I mean, that's a huge deal at this point as we face even trying to open up the institutions that I'm at and many other people here are at. So I think that's a summary.
Excellent. And well, thank you, Mary. And not to name any names of any countries, so we don't want to go there, but right now there does seem to be some finger pointing about, did a country tell other countries, or did another country not listen? Would this at least solve some of that challenge? Because now it's just, people will know. It'll be monitoring wastewater. It won't be tied to specific people, but now we just know. And it's not this issue of, did you tell us or not, or did you respond or not? With this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're looking for, as I mentioned, we're looking for viral-based RNA. So we're not pulling, human DNA or anything like that. Although I do think there are real privacy issues, as Melissa talked about. But yeah, absolutely, there wouldn't be, there would be a way to sort of get to localized transmission patterns, as well as try and think about, what do decision makers do when, you see a real-time change in wastewater viral load, because you might think about, well, if there's a change in transmission, you could think about, impacting supply chain, changing testing protocols, reinforcing social distancing norms, stuff like that. So, of course, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. And I'd like to now go to Divya. Divya, could you real quick introduce yourself? And I'll ask the same question, like, where are we at in terms of what science and technology can do to help us know faster and respond faster to future waves of the virus?
Hi, everybody. I'm Divya Chandra. I'm the chair for neuroscience at Singularity. I'm also a practicing anesthesiologist and working on network systems actually for integration of sensors. But I actually, let me start by picking up on what Mary said. She's bringing up this idea of passive sensing, which, David, you've been alluding to as well. There was recently a paper published in medRxiv actually that showed that sampling wastewater in the way that Mary's describing is actually able to pick out hotspots in areas, and it's so far above the number of cases that were identified through positive testing. But let's take that a little bit further. Smart toilets is another way actually to use this kind of passive sensing. So your stool is just full of great information, and there's no reason why your toilet can't help us understand some of it. And when you combine that with other kinds of passive sensors, imagine you have everybody seems nowadays carrying around a smartphone, and even if not a flip phone, that's actually pretty prevalent for most of the world. Things like a cough or a sneeze or changes in vocal patterns of people, when you combine things like that with artificial intelligence, you can actually learn a lot of information about what's going on, whether there's respiratory distress, whether there are other new hotspots. Let me throw a couple other things out there. In the active sensing world, where someone actually has to make a choice to instrument themselves, let's say it's with a Fitbit or something, we can use some of these with people's consent and permission and anonymize the data to use that to identify new cases. A great example was a study that was just published from Scripps Research Institute in combination with Fitbit. And people whose baseline heart rates began to rise, that was positively correlated with developing COVID-19 and testing positive. So that's another example of using wearables and sensors. There are new integrated sensors. Some of them were developed in response to things like the X Prize. They're like tricorders, and bringing those into the networks that Lee and Darryl were talking about, these kinds of things are very, very important. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to things like leveraging artificial intelligence and combining it with genome sequencing. One of the ways we've been able to track the virus around the world is by looking for mutations in the virus's genome. You can see the origin that way. You can see where it's traveled, who's carried it, and not at a personal level, but you can just sort of track these things. But importantly, you can actually compare it to naturally occurring viral genomes and begin to make hypotheses about whether things are naturally occurring or they could be the result of synthetic biology or bioterrorism.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head in terms of we need to be ready for a future in which not only are these things going to come about naturally, which is what we currently think with COVID-19, but unfortunately with personalized medicine, there's also personalized poison. And so who's going to detect it? How are you going to respond to it? And so we clearly need a better way forward. Let me go a little bit further, because you were talking about how it's good to understand what can be done with AI and high performance computing. If we did sequence, whether it's a virus or bacteria, and then try to figure out what the three-dimensional presentation might be, whether it's of its RNA sheath or anything like that, could we then start looking for drug therapies too, and actually have that be sort of semi-autonomous as well, and so we're not waiting for humans to get involved?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great question. So something like that is being done with the viral spike protein right now. For most of your listeners, the spike protein is the way that the virus attaches to human cells and actually infects us. The problem is spike proteins are not just static. They actually change their morphology constantly. There's an organization that sort of spun out of Stanford called Folded at Home. And what they do is they crowdsource computing power in order to track changes in morphology, potential morphology. It's a very hard computing problem to see where we may be able to design drug targets to map to all the different configurations of that spike protein in order to neutralize the virus. Another way AI is being leveraged is we have a lot of drugs sitting around that potentially could work for this particular pandemic and future pandemics. And that kind of looking to see where the lock and key mechanism is, that is really hard for an individual human to do. But if we leverage things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, we can find new ways of using old drugs. And then we also have their safety profile in humans.
Excellent. Thank you, Divya. And going back to what Lee said, we need to jump from the cloud to the edge. And this is about getting machine learning at the edge. Would now like to turn to Darryl. And Darryl, if you could real quick introduce yourself. And I'm going to pivot to a slightly different topic and say, could these approaches we're talking about be applied to other systems, such as systems involving Internet of Things sensors or other cyber physical systems as well?
Yeah, so while I've been working with the Department of Defense and particularly cyber physical systems, cybersecurity over the last 10 years, just want to make sure everyone's aware I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense today. But the DoD operates with an enormous portfolio with over 500,000 facilities, over 500 bases, post camp station yards and centers like that. So any kind of technology, any kind of processes that can provide indications and warnings of these type of viruses or other kind of things that could impact mission operations would be welcome, especially since Secretary Esper yesterday put out a memo giving the authority to base commanders going to make their decisions locally when they can kind of change their modes of protecting their folks, of going from HP condition Charlie to Bravo and such. But they're going to need information to do that. And also, Assistant Secretary for Health, Greer, testified just the other day about, and mentioned that wastewater from a dorm or entire segment of a campus could be tested to determine whether there's coronavirus in that sewage. So, following on that, if we have more sensors, if we have more data coming in, obviously we can be better informed. From a cybersecurity perspective, we got to be concerned about the potential exploitation. If information gets out that this place has got more infections than another, what could that imply? What if that information was spoofed? What if somebody said this was a bad area, but it really wasn't a bad area? So there are protections we need to get in place. But I like, one of the things that this opportunity is offering is it is actually going to provide testing, with the sensors that it's promoting. I've seen a lot of solutions being offered to where, hey, you can put a lot of our sensors everywhere. We'll give you all the secure data. We'll manage everything through the cloud. And then when you ask, have they implemented this in their own building? They haven't done that. So that's what I think is great about this. It's an opportunity to show, hey, we're actually using this and deploying this. So I think risk decisions based on this kind of data is going to be important, and getting information out to usable to the folks who own and operate these systems as well. Just quickly, there's a lot of those folks who run facilities, fuel centers, logistics centers, manufacturing and such. They're not cyber specialists. They're not data specialists. So getting a solution out that can help inform them based on the sensors that are close by, I think would be very prudent.
Well said, Darryl, and I agree with you 100% that we need to make sure we're using what we're offering. If not, then we're not practicing what we preach. And like you also said, I mean, I can't claim to be an expert on how a smoke detector, the inner parts of it, but I need to have one in my house, and so that same analogy applies too. Would now like to turn to Yusuf. Yusuf, could you introduce yourself real quick, and how can we make sure these efforts are inclusive of communities and are more people-centered in nature?
Thank you very much. My name is Yusuf Abdul Qadir. I'm a Central New York chapter director for the ACLU of New York, as well as an adjunct faculty in information policy at Syracuse University. Again, I'm speaking not on behalf of any of those institutions, but really as an emerging thinker, researcher at the intersections of tech, privacy, and equity. And so this is quite an appropriate question because as we think about the proliferation of our data, and particularly in the context of COVID and the way with which we've seen kind of legacy disparities having an impact on the way with which this proliferation of data, this Internet of Things world that we live in, has shown not only that we have not risen to the occasion previously, but that we're not cognizant of the types of ways with which those legacies currently impact the realities that we see. We're going to further see issues, whether it's issues with regards to abuse of data by kind of surveilling and leveraging surveillance, whether it's exploiting people's personal data from a health perspective. And so I want those legacies so that we can be clear about the need to be proactive in developing a more inclusive society. And what that means is thinking critically about viewing the internet, for instance, as a public utility. Right now, students all across the country are going to classes digitally. They may not have access to devices. They may not have access to high-speed broadband. And so thinking about the ways in which we're going to ensure that the internet is viewed as a public utility and really as a fundamental right. Not only looking at the internet in that regard, but trying to make sure that people have digital literacy and ramping up the skill sets that people have. We know that there are going to be some million jobs that exist in this industry, but we don't necessarily have the types of people who are trained to do so. We can be taking a type of kind of concerted focus with making sure that we address issues of equity, issues of concentration of poverty, issues of disparities, and leveraging them as unique opportunities to uplift those communities, to create a more inclusive society, and really fulfill the types of mandates that we've had as being a more integrated, pluralistic, racially diverse democracy.
Well said. I mean, I was watching the different panelists as you were speaking, Yusuf, and they were several of them were nodding their heads. So I think you have some strong support, and I imagine what you put forward. If we are not cognizant of the past as well as the challenges of the present, we will not have the solutions we want for the future for a more pluralistic society. So thank you for that. And actually, if anything, you just teed it up perfectly for Lynne Wells from the People-Centered Internet Coalition. Lynne, would you like to comment on what Yusuf was also saying about how we can do and make sure things are inclusive of communities and we respect people's choices with regards to opting in and privacy?
Absolutely. I'm Lynne Wells from George Mason Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, and as David mentioned, from the People-Centered Internet. I think one of the key points in working with communities is you've got to spend time to establish a relationship with them. It's not enough to just kind of parachute in as an outsider and say, yo, I've got an answer, and the answer will be, I'm really busy. And one of the real lessons I learned some years ago was from the director of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Energy Lab, where he said, look, I've got a website, and I have like 70 needs that I've got on that website. And if somebody shows up saying, look at this great answer I've got, my first question is, have you taken the time to see what I need? And if your solution is not addressing some of my needs, then thank you, go elsewhere. So I think the first thing you need to do is begin by listening to what the community is trying to tell you and what they need. And I just spent a couple of hours recently going through the websites of Southern Northern communities, Northern Virginia communities, to understand what they're asking for, and it's out there. We just need to pay attention. The second, just following up on Yusuf's point, is you need to address the underserved parts of the community. It's not just the high rollers and the wealthy folks. It's got to be representative across the community. And as scientists and techies, you need to explain this in terms that make sense to the decision makers. If you go in there saying you'll be compliant with NIST special publications 800, 160, whatever, you've lost the argument. So how do you say this is why it's going to be good for your people? Two more things. So one is Mason has this Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities that tries to bottom-up focus on how communities can become more resilient. And the last point is I'm really pleased to say that we're going to try to take some of the Syracuse and the ESF work on wastewater sensing and apply it in the Mason dormitories this fall as we bring the students back. The administration is looking at that, trying to see how a way it could be implemented. So you'll be able to walk the walk.
Excellent. And what I love, Lynne, is it's an example of lessons being shared across localities and states. Here's something that was done in New York and it's now being shared with Virginia, and those lessons could be shared with other states as well. And I think, if anything, that's when the U.S. is at its best, is when we're doing things locally, but we're sharing the lessons across the country and ideally globally. I'm now going to pivot back to Divya. And Divya, I know you touched upon this a little bit, but could you go a little bit further? I mean, what other new technologies could we use to protect people and facilities using this approach of, instead of relying on governments to let us know when something's going on, we're actually using technology to alert us, and then we can take action ourselves?
Well, there's a couple of layers of this. Let me just open my answer by saying that one of the critical pieces of this is that data needs to be integrated and it needs to be made actionable. You can't just keep collecting data and then hope that something comes of it. It has to be meaningful. So let me give two examples in that context. One would be the idea of contact tracing. Contact tracing is something that a lot of East Asian countries use in order to keep their people safe, and also in many cases to prevent full lockdowns. And contact tracing is actually something that's been used for a very long time. For instance, there have been apps running around the world. There's one in between New Zealand and Australia for tracking flu symptoms, and you opt into that sort of thing. The issue with contact tracing right now is, to speak to Yusuf's point, it's a lot of people are fearful that it would become a privacy violation. So the idea would be, you have a smartphone, someone else has a smartphone, and if somehow you tested positive for COVID-19, you would interact with your phone, and then somebody else who entered, say, the Trader Joe's or the Whole Foods with you, or was in the park with you, would know that somebody around them might have had COVID-19, they'd been exposed. So the key to all of this working to make it actionable is that there have to be ways of ensuring privacy. And so that information is hashed and it's kept secure. And even though the information is traded via Bluetooth, via phones, and some companies like Nodal are trying to do it through mesh networks, there's a way in which you preserve your individual rights while helping other people to also take care of their own. But the second piece of it is a bigger piece. Let's say you're trying to protect a large group of people or reopen a state, or protect our troops in the case of Darryl. If you have no way of integrating data that it can be acted on sensibly, then all of this is for naught. And so I think we need to build infrastructure and networks that are, number one, interoperable. As a physician, I will tell you that there are so many companies that have, like, the blood pressure cuff is made by somebody different who makes your pulse oximeter. And none of these devices talk to one another. And the question is, how do we pull data in, unlock it, anonymize it, but identify it and label it in such a way that a public health official can act on it, but also we can train algorithms on that kind of data. And then can you wrap privacy and security layers around it? And finally, can you bring disparate kinds of data together, whether it's contact tracing or sewage water testing, or things like viral mutation? Can they all come together so we can make decisions?
Excellent. Thank you, Divya. And Darryl, I'll ask you the same question. What would be your thoughts about applying these new technologies and or approaches to data to protect people in facilities?
Especially from a facility perspective, I think we're going to see those that do apply secure technologies could find themselves as a differentiator for clients. So for example, would you rather stay in a hotel or get a medical procedure in a hospital that has claimed it's more secure, that its data is more secure, has applied some of these technologies? For years, those may remember the Green Building Council, had come up with an idea of, let's implement, renewable designs, and we'll put badges outside of all these buildings if they meet these requirements. It took several years before that really took on, but now you can't buy equipment. You can't design a building without going through the process. All the parts and things that go into a building now, there's all meet certain requirements. So I really see that being a different potential differentiator. I also think insurance companies are going to also potentially lower your premium. If you have these certain type of technologies in there, and then people making risk decisions will be able to be better informed if they know that there are more secure solutions being implemented than others. So I think from a facilities perspective, there's a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of secure solutions, and again, I think it could be a differentiator on getting customers over.
Excellent. And I like how you said we could use healthy motivation, whether it's LEED building certification to motivate people to do it, or motivating people to actually, it would be lower insurance premiums, and that would be a motivation. And I think that's something that we need to always think about, because oftentimes we think of great solutions, but we got to figure out what's going to motivate people to take that action. And so now I'm going to pivot to Yusuf and say, what could communities do to start using these new approaches, whether they be the technology or data, without having to wait for government and industries to act? What could communities do themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to give a shout out to one organization that is really thinking about these issues really well, Data for Black Lives. They've really done a lot of work to try to think about the way with which the intersections of equity, racial justice, and the proliferation of data can be used in proactive ways to identify disparities, create solutions to problems, and really create an ecosystem where we're not running away from the fears that exist from the proliferation of data, but we're actually using it in ways that are highly useful. And so I would encourage folks to look out for them and to monitor their work. I would be remiss if I didn't also speak to the work that Lee, myself, and others in the city of Syracuse are doing with respect to designing cloud architecture that develops a series of ways to protect data, to have levels of authorization by doing it in a way that is secure and thinking critically about inclusivity. And so communities like Syracuse, which is a mid-sized city, it's not a large city, it's not the New Yorks, it's not the Los Angeles of the world. It's a mid-sized Rust Belt, former legacy city that has been really hard hit with high levels of concentration of poverty and hypersegregation, are thinking really critically about how do we bring us to being into this fourth industrial revolution by attacking it from every area that we can, by leveraging the opportunities that can exist in this area, but really taking consideration of the fact that we have this painful history of displacement due to the creation of the interstate highway system, that we have a painful legacy of segregation that still exists with us today. And so I think when you look at communities like this, and no one has it perfect, and we're still doing really robust work to try to help identify solutions, it really requires a broadening of our understanding of who stakeholders are, and making sure to really to the point of our colleagues that have mentioned, listening to communities and centering our issues and our thought processes and the solutions by integrating them as not an afterthought, not secondary, as really the experts on the issues. There's a phrase that we use in the organizing world: nothing about us without us. And so it is really essential that those communities are not a part of the solution, but really core to understanding how do we emerge out of this in that regard.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Yusuf. And sort of building on what Yusuf just said, I'm now going to go to Mary, Lee, and Lynne, if you, so we can get to audience questions. If you could try and do like a 1 minute each answer. Sorry. How can scientists help communities jumpstart this? Or what can scientists do to work with communities to make this happen? Mary?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would build on what Divya and Darryl and Yusuf said about data collaboration, community collaboration and inclusion, institutional level collaboration, and say that, although interdisciplinarity is a word that's been around for a long time in academia, it's not always that easy to do, right? And I think we're in a special position in Syracuse, where we have these three institutions and we have a tight-knit group of, diverse skill sets pulling together students and faculty members and community members to try and create, some way to keep the data open and observable, through this open data observatory project, right, where we try and be as transparent with both real-time data collection and dissemination, as well as through, modeling approaches we might take to try and guess whether changes in viral load are going to be linked to things that decision makers might want to implement. And I guess I would just end by saying that, tight connections to decision makers, information that's packaged up right in a way that decision makers can use it, is where I think scientists need to be headed, because, we get a lot of credit for publications, and all of those things should still happen. But, linking to actionable science and being a creator of actionable science is core to what our group is doing. And I think that we are at institutions that support that and value that. And we know that. So.
Excellent. And like you said, we need to reward not just writing a paper, but also making the data available in a way that's accessible, and that will drive a lot of the change. So. Yeah. Thank you, Mary, for that. I'm now going to turn to Lee and Lynne, and the same question with a slightly different pivot. Lee, imagine that maybe either Google or Apple came to you and said, what can we do to help scientists jumpstart these efforts in communities? What would you have as your pitch to Google or Apple?
Well, thanks for asking, Vint, so seriously, that is exactly the question. We are engaged through the Secure Cloud Architecture Action Cluster that Yusuf mentioned with several of the major cloud vendors. Microsoft is a partner with all the campuses and the county and the city in Syracuse, already working on data partnerships. So we have the open door, and what we want is to move forward, but not just locally, but globally, because this is, again, it's actually not so bad in upstate New York, we'll admit, right now, thankfully. But that makes it a good place to do these studies and get this research out. So we're looking to scale this research worldwide absolutely as fast as possible. And that doesn't happen unless companies like Google and Amazon and so on step up. So I have a modest $25 billion ask. that I'd like to lay out for a cyber physical infrastructure testbed global network that would leverage off the same secure cloud architecture, that would provide open access to data worldwide through common agreements on what's yellow data, what's red data, and what's green data. Green data is what we all want to have shared worldwide, and now we know what it means, because I think we already know what it means. I don't have to tell you, it's like a stoplight, get it? So mayors understand it, everybody understands it. We all want green data, and that's what we're putting in our open data observatory. And then, oh yeah, business, there's many ways to monetize some of that yellow and red data, which we don't have time for now to discuss, but that's why they may be interested in talking further. So I think it's time to move, and seriously, let's do it.
Excellent. And I like also the phrase, data is the new green. So now I'll circle to Lee and say the same question, but this time maybe it's Microsoft and IBM approach you and they say they want to do something like with this to accelerate scientists working with communities in a people-centered manner. What would be your one minute or so pitch to them?
I think the first piece is that narrative and storytelling is absolutely critical. We talk a lot about STEM, okay, but there's also a model of STEAM, where you add in art and design. And so if you listen to the community tells you what it is they want, and you go off and do your analyses and come back with all sorts of differential equations and spaghetti diagrams, you're going to lose the argument. So how do you address this in a way that makes sense both the scientists and the community?
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. And now we're going to go to audience Q&A. If you are on social media watching this on Twitter, please use the hashtag GoodTechChoices, and we will strive to bring your question to the group. We do have two questions, and they sort of ask the same thing, and I think this is going to go both to Mary and Divya, because it's a fairly in-depth scientific one. Basically, the two questions are asking, how accurate are we with wastewater sampling in terms of knowing the actual correlation between detecting the presence of COVID-19 and what does that actually mean in terms of the number of people? And then also, how early are we talking about in terms of the early detection here? So maybe Mary, I'll go to you first on the science question.
Sure. I think that there's no specific day number or person count number that we would even pretend we could say, right? But what we can do is that we have spent a significant amount of effort developing a way to test for SARS-CoV-2 RNA in wastewater using relevant genomic assays and controls that would account for changes in environmental flows like precipitation or other more technical things. I think that what is really important, though, is to make integrated modeling systems that contribute to the open data initiatives we've talked about. And so we're still in the process of coming up with the modeling approaches, but really the goal would be to try and predict hotspots using existing data to predict cases that we know exist, right? And then we can calibrate and figure out what the best guess would really be. And what is really important about this approach is that specific to this virus, there's detection much earlier in the pathogen's infectious disease cycle, right? So we are about a day out, I think, is what we've looked at. So it's about a day after the infection starts that humans are shedding fecally. So you could, if you're testing, we'll have a lot more development in the context of more specific sampling approaches. But at this point, what we know is that about a day after infection, you'll see signals in the wastewater, which can be correlated to changes over time, of course, because the temporal dimension is really what matters. What matters here as well. So.
Well, excellent, and that maybe answers. There was another question here, which was, could this then, when people are talking about why does this matter, and I agree with you 100% that it needs to be an integrated solution, but especially given that COVID-19 does not present physical signs in a person until much later, could this at least let us know if maybe an airplane, if you're flying on an airplane and at least somebody on the plane has something that has COVID, or someone on a ship or a boat has something like that too? Could this be for cases like that? It can at least let you know something odd is going on this vessel of some sort.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we're talking about, I think that, we mentioned dormitories earlier as a high density point at which you might be doing sampling to, detect upstream change. But I mean, putting this on a boat or a plane, or, I think those are also discussions we've had.
Excellent. And it does, and as you said, it also gives us about 2 weeks early notification as opposed to just waiting for the patient to present symptoms.
Right.
Divya, I'm going to ask you the same thought, but with not just thinking about COVID-19, could we do this for other viruses as well? Are we limited to just COVID-19 in doing this, or could we do this for other viruses too?
Oh no, you could do it for everything. So let me build a little bit let's bring Mary's answer into this. I saw somebody in the chat also specifically said you can't use it to assess true rates, and that there may be a lot of false positives in this and other kinds of passive sensing. All true, but if you are relying on an asymptomatic person to go and get a test, think about the number of false negative rates that you have simply because of our sampling bias. So what techniques like that Mary is deploying, and companies like BioBot, which comes out of Cambridge, what they're doing is actually saying, hey, look, you can feel like you're sick, you can feel like $1 million, but it doesn't matter. If COVID-19 RNA is present, we're going to find it. And even if you don't have an exact match between the total viral burden in your sewage wastewater and what that actually means for the total number of individuals, you can certainly say, like in the last paper, close to 200,000 people appeared that they may have had it, and only about 155 had tested positive. I mean, look at that incredible delta. And then to your question, David, if we continue to sample our wastewater, there are all kinds of pathogens that we can detect. And so this could form the kind of early warning systems that we've been talking about here. And it might also alert us to new kinds of pathogens that are rapidly evolving that we didn't know about. It also could allow us to understand, even within a single pathogen, how it might be mutating and whether new virulent strains are occurring. And finally, some of our vaccine technology, both our mRNA and our DNA vaccine, think of Moderna, who's hit the news, or Inovio, a lot of that is based on viral sequencing. And so the earlier we have this data, the more we can build preventive measures and help people develop herd immunity.
Excellent. And I think you laid the case, which is we are already underestimating. And so while this maybe has the risk of other challenges, and the other thing that I would also say, and maybe I'll now pivot to Lee, could we possibly, right now we may just be doing this at sewage treatment plants, but maybe over time, if we get more increasing magnitudes of these tests, could we do them on neighborhoods? So we're not doing it on the specific house, but we could at least say this street, somebody has COVID-19 per what's being seen on the street. And then that could allow sort of public health officials to go to that street. So is that possible, Lee?
Yeah, so absolutely. This is such an important area. I expect a lot of investment, whether it's the folks we talked about or others. But many tries on automating, using natural language processing to improve processes, robotics. We can just AI. We can just sort of say this is not an insurmountable problem of harvesting a lot of really great knowledge from Mary and other colleagues' heads fast, because it's important to move this forward so it's usable on campuses, in office buildings, in dorms, and on every single street. I think this needs to happen. It's not perfect, but it'll get this early, and it definitely gives a notice of if there's an infection on the street, we'll know it. We won't know exactly how many or when, but we'll know it when it happens, when it gets to that. I think that's a big value for everyone.
Right. It's sort of like, again, with the smoke detector. The smoke detector tells you there's fire in the building. It may not tell you exactly where, but it tells you there's fire in the building, and that there's value in that. I'm now going to turn to Melissa and Lynne, because you both in past lives have had to make hard decisions involving volumes and volumes of data. First to Melissa and to Lynne, real quick, how would you like this presented to you if you were a decision maker in ways that could trigger action and take responses? So Melissa first.
For me, the first thing is don't come in and tell me you know something you don't know. I know a million smart people, and they're all scientists, and they've all got a PhD. And when somebody comes in with the solution and doesn't tell me There are countervailing points of view. These are the assumptions we're making. This is what this cannot do for you, but this is what it can do for you. Then I can make an informed decision. The DoD alone has over 66 and probably many more, but government laboratories that are all trusted partners. We've got FFRDCs and UARCs out the wazoo. I have thousands of people who were the smartest, most trusted person that I could listen to. But once you have that many trusted partners, who do you trust? And everybody needs to be funded by me. And so I have to make a lot of decisions in the context of bias of people needing to sell me a solution so they can go back and say, this person valued my opinion over everybody else's. So I need people to be more humble and less and give me the whole story, because I'm going to trust you more if you tell me what you can't do than if you just come in and tell me you're the smartest person in the room. Too many smart people in the world. I'm not the smartest one, but I've given a lot of money away and I can smell BS a mile away.
Which is appropriate given we're talking about wastewater here. So now I'll circle to Lynne. Lynne, your thoughts too, because you've had to make hard decisions too involving this. What would be your quick recommendations to people?
Yeah, so Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, one time made a comment about climate change, and he said, when looking at these kinds of really complicated problems, the unforgivable sin is hubris. My answer is the only answer, okay? But the other piece is, if you're dealing with a complex problem, as soon as you start to solve it, you begin to change the problem. And so the solution is almost always going to be iterative. And what we found in doing this is the really important thing at the beginning is to document your going in assumptions so that you can begin to see, is my solution bringing me towards the expectations I had, or do I need to change? And the very important leadership part of this is to articulate to both the team that I'm going to schedule a review of this at some fixed point. And if the review dictates a change, that's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. So there's a sociological part to it, and there's a technological part to it, and they need to be put together.
So structure it to be able to pivot. Excellent. And so now, Yusuf, I would like to ask you, we've been talking about the science and everything like this. From the perspective of different things you've seen about doing community inclusion, are there ways that this could be structured where members of the community were actually working hand in glove with the scientists to make sure, that either if there's things or biases are present, that the biases are being addressed, or if there's things are missing? What might be your recommendations that could involve the community to work with the scientists so that you get a better result?
Yeah, I think that the common theme that I'm going to be talking about is making sure that we are engaging and including communities in really robust ways. As an engagement scholar, a lot of my work has been in trying to make sure that we are centering and engaging communities. To take a concrete example of not necessarily in the data kind of tech field, but in thinking about public health issues as it relates to gun violence, there's a kind of collaboration that existed between a group in Syracuse called the Street Addiction Institute, which looked at how are ways with which the features of gang and gun violence kind of creates a sense of addiction and a culture of addiction, and leveraging and pairing them with sociologists at the university to be able to help develop and create understanding, literature, and research, and then producing this research. That was a profound, I think, breakthrough in the type of engaged scholarship. Last summer, I was a part of the first cohort, the Center for Democracy and Organizing at Berkeley, in which there was a pairing between experts, kind of organizers, people that were involved in social justice work, and PhD academics, and kind of thinking through, again, these type of similar collaborations. And so I think understanding and respecting the expertise that these communities have, valuing that expertise and realizing that they have windows into things that you don't. I mean, a lot of academic work is really about peer-reviewed discussions and theoretical frames, and aren't necessarily about praxis, which is the merging of practice and really theory. And it is in the merging of these two areas that we find that we can actually really have more profound insights to these issues. And so we're going to try to think about, in this context, ways with which we can leverage the expertise that exists in communities, while also thinking through the formalized structures that exist for kind of collecting data, analyzing data and sharing that data. I think those are the types of approaches that I think are really the kinds that we need to use to begin to approach addressing these issues and identifying best practices for kind of creating these types of partnerships.
Excellent. Thank you. And then lastly, real quick, before we go to the lightning round, I'd like to go to Darryl. I saw you were smiling a little bit when Melissa was making her comment about, the challenges of making decisions and how everyone thinks they're the smartest person in the room. What would be your, if someone was to come to you and try and make the case for doing this, what would be your recommendation for how it's presented to make it as a fruitful as endeavor as possible?
Well, as I mentioned before, to show that they've actually tested it or have come up with a way to involve the community and shown how this could be useful beyond just theoretical, and sought some collaborative partnerships, to show that that this can be implemented in a even though a small scale, it could be ramped up to a larger scale. Yusuf's point is just spot on. When I first saw this, I was so excited to think that, imagine if every college or university, their labs were all involved with this, and any other school, high schools, or that also, could be a part of, being part of the data collection or analysis. So I think that would be great. I think, what this is almost a calling for is not just a pure entrepreneurial spirit. This is really the entrepreneurial spirit of the businesses who are already in there, and really to get behind figuring out how they can adapt to the change that's needed, and kind of whole new processes, the way we think about how we collect, store, and analyze this type of data that helps our folks and facilities. Over.
Excellent. And I love that you brought entrepreneurs. That's probably also a first for the Atlantic Council, but you're so right. Sometimes we focus so much on the external, we miss the community connectors. All right, so we're now at the lightning round as we try to wrap things up. You each get 2 to 3 tweets max with a recommendation as to what world leaders, could be world leaders from government, private sector, the public, community, but what are 2 to 3 tweets that you would recommend that world leaders do to make this happen? I'm going to go first to Lynne and then Yusuf as we wrap things up. Lynne?
3, listen to both your community's head and heart. Science is the head, the people are the heart.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lynne. And that was very concise. All right, Yusuf, what would be your recommendations?
Recognize the existing kind of legacies that predate the types of issues we're seeing and use them as opportunities to create solutions to the problems we have. That might be longer than 140 characters, but
it's okay. We're doing the extended tweet, so you're fine. Hashtag drop the mic. You're great. That's terrific. Thank you. Darryl, what would be your 2 to 3 recommendations?
Well, where do you want to be in 5 years from now? And how are you going to get there? And you just can't wait for someone else to do it. How can you get involved to be part of the solution?
Excellent. I love that. See the future, make sure you have a vision, and then don't wait. Time is of the urgency. Thank you. Divya, your turn, and then Mary.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. So I have a few. So one is to look at sustainable ways to open up your economies, because things that are kind of in harmony with Mother Earth are much more likely to stay in place and lead to less future disease. The second is to protect your most vulnerable. The distribution of resources, sanitation, food, and healthcare not only protects those vulnerable people, but it protects everyone on the planet because of how interconnected we are. And finally, consider your global food sources, whether it's a wet market or a factory farm. We know that these things are contributing essentially to zoonotic spread of viruses. And we may be in an era in which we are become more plant-based, kind to animals, and look at cell-based meat products.
Excellent. Thank you, Divya. Mary, your recommendations?
My Twitter skills are weak, but I would say that where I'm at is something like detect and predict to be ready, and a plug for the Open Data Observatory and how that really needs to be there to collect to deal with really what we face as a planet. I think that thinking in these traditional boundaries of nation states, which is helpful in some ways, is hard in this case. And then I would also just say that something about multiple knowledges, recognizing, collaborations from everybody who knows things, right? People who know things should be at the table rather than just people who have access to a seat.
Very well said. And I apologize because this is a surprise on your part. We're playing Jeopardy here, and you just landed on the Daily Double, so you get an extra question that came from the audience.
Okay.
Extra question was, what would be your recommendations to scientists to make this happen? So now you're speaking to the scientific community and the role of scientists.
Sure. So I have a long history in these interdisciplinary center grants. So all my training as a PhD student, as a postdoc, were in interdisciplinary settings, and I think that learning languages of those who are in all types of scientific fields is really important to be able to spur the type of development that is needed here. And so sometimes that means that the metrics of success that the academic world is so connected to have to be put aside at least a little bit. But I would also just, my last piece of advice would be to sit back and listen, because sometimes you not only learn something, but you engender trust between the people that you're connecting to. And I think that that it goes a long way to listen to what everybody is doing, and try and figure out, how do I fit in, and what did I learn from the way that they're speaking and the knowledge that they use, and how can I figure out how that fits into what I do, and we're just at a really critical point here to be able to contribute really at a global level, I would say.
Excellent, and very well said. And I liked how you said, leadership sometimes means doing the right thing, even if it doesn't necessarily bring immediate rewards or anything like that. And then two, like you said, listen before you seek to be listened to. So now, Melissa, you and then Lee, you have the unenviable task of following everybody else. But what's your recommendations to world leaders?
Let's make networking a public good. Iowa Communications Network, they already do this in Iowa. Rural areas already think about, how do I make sure that all my schools, hospitals, libraries, everyone are connected, and they do it from the state. We have cities who are doing this in partnership with industry, but let's actually do it. Like, stop talking about it and do it. It is a public utility. Let's make it one. I don't think we need to wait. The second thing is, let's get over the hyper efficiency hangover from the last decade. Stop obsessing over making everything hyper efficient and start realizing we need resiliency. So I'm going to open myself up to more cyber attacks when I start doing everything digitally. So when that happens, I need to be able to pivot to something that is more human-based. And when that causes a spike in some disease, I need to be able to pivot back to something that allows me to continue services. I need to have local supply outlets. I need to have national ones as well. We've got to be more resilient and less fragile. So get over, we're never going back. Get over it. All the people who want better buying, like all the efficiency, get over it. We're not going back. Let's get to resiliency.
Love it. Very well said, Melissa. And I feel like we could probably get some bumper stickers made. That's great. All right. Finally, Lee, you have the final recommendation, 2 to 3 tweets for world leaders here.
Yeah, so just to get real specific, we're at G7 in next month, right? So this is a G7 tweet. It's Global Immune System Agreed for Resiliency. You happy with that one, David?
That's wonderful. Terrific.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one real quick. The second one would be the detailed one, which is a $25 billion. Okay, now we'll double it because it's those companies plus the world leader. So it's now $50 billion cyber physical infrastructure testbed program, because we certainly in Syracuse, we love doing the work we're doing, and we love to collaborate with George Mason, with Stanford, with everybody else. And we will be planning to do that through upcoming meetings. I'll just say a little bit that this is not the tweet, but this is, I have a little experience in multi-party loose cooperations for accelerating innovation. I think we need to do that right now. And we all here in Syracuse look forward to working with everyone on it, whether in government, in industry, and academia. And you'll hear more about that soon.
Excellent. Well, very well said, Lee. And I'll just do the final last tweet for everyone, which is immune system for the planet. We can do it. The time is now. Thank you all for your time, for being a great panel. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for being positive change agents, and we'll see you next time. Take care.